Aloha, everybody.
Aloha.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. I'm going to start the clock ticking. My goal tonight is, in the next 15 minutes, to just give everybody in the room a tangible sense of what the state budget is about. What's in it, how it's developed, what some of the important choices are that we have to make as a community about what we want to spend on and where we want that money to come from, and then how we can affect the process of shaping the budget that happens largely in this building. Yeah? So, I have 10 slides and 9 of them are pictures, okay? Here we go. This first picture is a picture of where the money comes from and where it goes to. The budget covers a 2-year period called a biennium, and it's about $12 billion each year. Now that's a figure that's so huge that it's really hard to imagine what that means, but I wanted to start here because this is a graphic representation of what goes in and what comes out. The important things that I think are, I'd like people to zero in on are, one is, half of everything that goes into the budget is what's called general funds, okay? The major source of these general funds are taxes and fees, and we have a lot of flexibility for how to decide what to do with this money here. That's about $12 billion out of a $24 billion biennium budget comes in the form of general funds. There are other funds here, federal funds, special funds that have other laws around how we use them, but this is our flexible pot of money. That's what goes in. What comes out, I've divided up into the different departments, okay? And this is typically how you'd see a budget as it's presented at the legislature in a pie chart or a graph like this. There's human services on the bottom. It's a giant chunk. Benefits, this is retirement benefits and health benefits for state workers or government workers, and debt, payments on the state debt. This is education, the University of Hawaii, health, transportation, and then a bunch of departments up top that are really too small to even fit the labels into, but they include things like public safety, economic development and tourism, the Department of Labor. But this gives you a sense of what comes in and then how it gets divided up among the major functional departments of the state. Okay? Now that doesn't tell us a whole lot about sort of how the money actually gets spent. It gives us some big categories to work with. But what's really interesting is when you kind of dig down into the detail of what's in there. Now that's tough to do in graphic form, but here's our best shot at turning the detail of the right-hand side of this graph into a picture. Okay? Under each of these black headings is one of those major functional areas. Okay, so this is education, and within education is special education, school operations, charter schools, teacher support. Each box is sized relative to the amount of money we spend on it. Okay? I don't know if the labels are big enough for you, but this actually exists on our site as an interactive graphic, and you can mouse over any of these small ones and the label pops up. See, general administration, that's how much we spend on the state's auto fleet. This section right here under this tab is environment. The biggest chunk in environment is funding for water facilities. So a couple things jump out when you look at the budget as a picture like this. First is there are some giant chunks that we spend on some very specific things. Okay? This piece here is just for Medicaid. That's healthcare payments and help to people that cannot afford health insurance in the marketplace. Okay? So this is Medicaid. This down here, school operations. This whole square is budget. This square within that is for school operations. And there's a bunch of other things in here, including libraries. And this box down here, funding for education for kids under the age of 5. Okay? There's a couple other big boxes I'd like to draw your attention to. One is this box here under this black header, and that's benefits. Okay? Again, that's all the retirement and health benefits for public employees. Okay? Also a large chunk of the budget. And I'll send everybody that signs up tonight a link to this, and you can mouse over the different boxes and give us some feedback on it. Yes?
Where's human services?
So this isn't organized by department so much. I mean, this is social services down here.
But compared to the previous chart, I'm wondering how it correlates.
The reason why this is different than this chart is because part of what's in human services is Medicaid.
Oh, okay.
Okay? But in this graph, it's categorized under health. This is a more functional look at what's in the budget. This is another way to get a sense of how much we're spending on different things. So I took maybe a dozen items in the budget that run the gamut from the very large to very small, and you can see how they compare to one another. Okay, just a different cut on those same boxes. Again, Medicaid is here. Now we spend about $4 billion a biennium every 2 years on Medicaid, but half of that comes from federal funds, and half of that is the state's contribution. Okay. Not all of this money is flexible. We can't just move everything around. There are some monies that are harder to move because we're required by federal law, by United States federal law, to spend on certain things. We have to make a contribution to Medicaid to match federal funds that then provide benefits to people, health benefits to people who cannot afford it, as an example. Okay? But overall, the thing I want to communicate in this graph is how huge some of these items are relative to some of the other items. Okay? Now there are things that we may think are important, that lawmakers may think are important, that even the governor may think is important and has announced are important. And it's interesting to look at where they fall on this spectrum. So for example, early childhood education has been talked about. We talked about it at the last Capitol workshop. It's been in the papers recently. The governor talked about it. But relative to other items in the budget, we're talking about the second item down there that barely registers on the graph. Okay? A couple other things that surprised me, for example, we spend roughly the same amount on prisons and mental health. Okay? That was interesting to me because I've been following the debate, for example, about gun control and how to keep ourselves safe. And there are two schools of thought about how to protect the public safety. One is to beef up security in prisons, and the other is to invest in mental health. And in Hawaii, we invest roughly the same in each strategy. We make relatively small investments in economic development and industries. The biggest investment we make directly in an industry is in tourism. We make about half that investment in agriculture. Okay? So when we talk about things, for example, Kanu Hawaii talks a lot about issues like food security, clean energy, managing our waste better. This gives us a sense of how those priorities are reflected in our decisions about where we put our money. A lot of trying to get a handle on what the budget is and what choices we have within it is about answering that question, or trying to wrap our heads around the question of, are we spending too much? Are we being taxed too much? Where are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? This was one way to get a sense of that, budget items relative to one another. Here's another way. This is our ranking, taxes first, the money in first, our state ranking in terms of our tax burden in different areas. Okay, so on the left-hand side here is how we rank in terms of the taxes we pay as a percentage of the total economy. Okay, a higher ranking means we're paying a higher percentage of taxes relative to the economy. A lower ranking means we're paying a lower percentage in taxes as a percent of the economy. So we're ranked 6th out of the 50 states in terms of the collections that government's taking in from taxes relative to the overall economy. Okay, so a relatively high tax burden we have here in Hawaii. Now, across the country, states have different ways of collecting up those taxes and those revenues that they're going to use to fund the budget. The 3 pillars, typically, of revenue are sales taxes or excise taxes, that's stuff charged on transactions, personal income taxes, that's what we pay every year, and then corporate income taxes, the taxes obviously our companies pay as businesses. And you can see here I broke out where we rank in terms of those 3 categories. We're number 1 in terms of the amount of sales and excise tax we pay. That's where the bulk of our revenue is coming from for the state. We're right in the middle of states when it comes to personal income taxes. And we're near the bottom of states when it comes to corporate income taxes. So what this means is that the strategy we've chosen as people, and that our leaders have chosen, to fund our activities is to depend largely on our excise tax, which is everything we pay for. If we sell it to somebody else, it gets taxed again. We've chosen to rely largely on this tax and not on the personal income tax or the corporate income tax. And other states adopt different strategies. Other states depend more heavily on a corporate tax or a sales tax. But that's where the money is coming from, and that's how we stack up in terms of other states. So the takeaway from this slide is our overall tax burden, pretty high. Most of it comes in the form of the excise tax.
It should also be noted that tourists pay a lot of the sales and excise tax, and that's why one of the reasons why it's so effective in our state without being the highest percentage is because we have a lot of non-residents paying taxes.
That's true. This measure kind of takes into account the overall size of the economy, including the amount visitors are spending. So if the economy was smaller, that figure would change. But that was a way of doing it so it's not sort of just based on the tax burden per capita on the number of people. It's really about the size of the economy and how much of that is taxes.
Where does property tax fit into?
Property tax in Hawaii is such a small portion of our tax base because unlike other states, we don't use property taxes to fund education systems. We have a statewide education system versus local and county education systems, so it's pretty negligible.
It's also primarily city and county.
It's all counties.
It's all rather than state. This is state, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are state taxes.
Yes.
Is there another breakdown of personal income tax? Because I was told that the Hawaii state income tax, personal income tax, is regressive. So the poor pay more than those that make more.
There is. There's a breakdown actually right on the tax department's website of the tax brackets for people, and you can take a look at that yourself. Overall, the tax system in Hawaii, and this is true not just of Hawaii but of many states, is regressive in that people with lower incomes are paying a higher percentage of their income in taxes than wealthier people. And this is a large part of it, the general excise tax, because we're paying taxes on everything we consume. And so if you have a smaller budget to start with, you have a smaller income to start with, more of your income, a larger percentage of your income is going to paying that than if you're wealthy and have a higher income. This is how we stack up in terms of our spending. So that was a ranking of our taxes, that's the money in, where it comes from. This is how we stack up in terms of spending. So there's a lot of debate about, are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? And these are 6 kind of major categories of expenditures and how we stack up compared to other states. So this is public education. We're 31st here, 35th here, 11th here, 26th, 41, 47. That's public schools. Higher education, our university system and community colleges. Social services, Medicaid, you remember that huge chunk of funds? Although we're spending a giant sum on it, we're right about in the middle of states, what other states spend on that as a portion of the total budget. Corrections and transportation. So the takeaway from this is that as much as the earlier pictures illustrate that we are spending large chunks of our budget on these things, we're not that much different than other states. In fact, we're spending about the same portion of our budget on these major functions, or a little less than other states.
What does corrections mean?
That's prisons, the parole system. So I think it's mainly the prisons and the parole system.
Is the reason we're so low on transportation because we have such a small state?
I'm not sure. That's a good guess, though.
Yeah, a lot of bridges and stuff.
Well, the other thing is that different from other states, our roads are divided between city and county and state. Not all states have that separation. So the state is only paying for state highways and state roads. City pays for city roads, and a lot of our smaller road systems are city and county.
So all of that up to this point is designed to give you a sense of what's in the budget, where the money comes from, where it's going, and then to sort of wrap our heads around this question of, are we spending too much or too little, and how would I get a sense of that? Like, how would I know if we're spending too much on education or too little on roads and transportation? This gives us a rough sense of that. Now, one of the things that I found shocking in looking at the numbers was where we stand in terms of our debt and our future liabilities. Now, liabilities are just commitments or promises that we've made to make certain payments in the future that haven't hit our tab yet. Okay, but we've made commitments to make them. And an example of future liability, probably the most important example, is what we've committed to our public workers in terms of retirement benefits and health benefits. Okay, so as the baby boomer generation retires and starts to claim these benefits, we're going to have to start paying out and making good on those past promises. That's a future liability. And just like in a household, if you know you have expenses coming up, we should be putting stuff away to make sure we have enough to pay for those. Right? Now, this has been actually a hot topic in budget circles lately because a lot of policy wonks and budget analysts have been looking at this across the 50 states and saying, you know what, the states actually have quite a bit of these liabilities built up because the baby boomers are about to retire. They also have debt they're carrying because states typically borrow money to build things like schools and other infrastructure. And states are not putting enough money away to make sure that they can pay for these things in the future. So this ranking here is done by Barron's, which is a financial analysis company. And what they did was they added up every state's outstanding debt and unfunded liabilities. That's future expenses that they haven't put money away for. And then they took that as a percent of the state's total economy and they ranked the states. So a higher ranking means that you have a higher percentage of the economy that's represented by that debt and those future liabilities. And we're ranked number 3 out of the 50 states. Okay. So we have, relative to other states, a large future burden coming up. We're carrying debt that we have to pay for. That's the bonds that fund our schools and our infrastructure. And we have a commitment to our seniors, our public worker retirees, that we need to make good on. Okay? Now, in recognition of this, and also because we just came through the Great Recession of 2008, and a group called the Tax Review Commission that normally gets together only every 5 years convened at the end, late in 2012. And they got together to take a look at this issue. They got together to look at the state's fiscal health and the future outlook for whether we'd be able to pay our bills. Okay? And here's the takeaway from their convening and their report. It says, within 2 years, the state will face an ever-growing budget gap. Unless actions taken now, the shortfall will be overwhelming and will require more burdensome measures that negatively impact the state. The annual shortfall is estimated at about $370 million a year. The range is actually between $200 and $400 million a year. Now, to give you a sense of how much that is, in the last biennium of the Great Recession, where we were still slashing the budget, we had to cut about $800 million from the budget, the biennium budget, in that 2-year period. Okay, so this is roughly equal to that. We're talking about cutting the budget the same amount as during the Great Recession. Okay? To put it a different way, going back to this graph of how we're spending our money, we have to imagine that what we have due in terms of health benefits and pension payments, along with the rising cost of healthcare, will turn a budget that looks like this today into a budget that looks like this 10 years from now. Okay? Now, what was there before was all this. Hospitals, mental health, the UH system. The equivalent of that will be spent on Medicaid and benefits alone. Okay? Now, those things aren't going to disappear. They're going to get shoved into this part of the picture. And each of these boxes will shrink as a result. Okay? So that's the kind of future obligation we're looking at in the next 10 years. And that's why the Tax Review Commission said, we got to do something about this now, so that this picture doesn't mean that we're eliminating important boxes from this. And instead, we're managing our future liabilities and promises to folks well. I'm not going to go over this in detail. I'm almost out of time, but there's some of the major recommendations that came out of the Tax Review Commission on how to make sure we can meet that $300 or $400 million shortfall over the course of the next couple of decades every year. They had things like reduce the pension exemption on the individual income tax. This is something that's been talked about the last several sessions actually, that pension income is exempt from being taxed. So we were gonna, one of the proposals was to eliminate that or reduce it at least. Eliminate the deduction on property taxes paid. If you pay property tax, you can actually deduct that from your income before you pay taxes. There's a couple of other, increase the corporate net income tax revenue. You remember from the rankings of how we stack up in terms of where our money comes from, our corporate income tax is relatively low compared to other states. But a lot of this stuff is actually some of their recommendations, going back to your point about the regressivity, about how lower income people actually shoulder a greater burden, a greater tax burden than higher income people. Some of these recommendations actually have the effect of reducing the amount of income coming in. And that's to make the tax system more equitable and more fair. That's what these recommendations are here. And the way it's made up for is in this recommendation down here, which is the punchline of the whole report, which is really the way to make up for that $370 million shortfall every year is to increase the general excise tax rate to 4.5% from its current level of 4%. Okay? So all these recommendations, if you took this one out, we wouldn't be tackling that deficit. But this last one, at $350 roughly million of additional revenue per year, is designed to make up for that. Okay? That was a major recommendation coming out of the Tax Review Commission, and will be considered by, what's been considered by the governor already, and will be considered by the legislature over the next couple of months.
And that most likely explains the regressivity too. Like if they're raising the GET, it's a regressive tax, they're trying to compensate.
Right, so they're trying to compensate for that by eliminating, by giving credits for things that are necessities, like food and medicine, and for, you're right, eliminating some of those taxes up above. So this is the process, okay? All of those figures you saw earlier in the rectangle, in the bar charts, they all come from the governor's budget. The governor and the administration, all the departments of the state have proposed their budget, okay? It's accessible online. It's been submitted to the legislature for its consideration, okay? The way the process works is, first, the state house takes a crack at its revisions to the budget, okay? And the key players here are the members of the Finance Committee, in particular the chair and the vice chair. The chair is Sylvia Luke in the House Finance Committee, and the vice chair is Scott Nishimoto, okay? They'll take their stab at revising what the governor has proposed. They'll pass it over to the Senate, and the Senate will take its turn at making revisions. The key players there are the members of the Ways and Means Committee, and the chair and vice chair are David Ige and Michelle Kidani, okay? I mention that because when we come back to action steps, those are the people to speak up to if you have an opinion about where we should be spending money or where we should be saving money, okay? Once they've each taken their stab at revising it, they'll come together to compromise over any differences that exist in the budget. That's called a conference committee. The legislature will pass its budget and hand it back to the governor for his signature. Now, even after it's signed, the governor still has the power to release or not release funds. He has the power to determine the timing of when those funds actually get allocated and spent. So even if something is in the budget, doesn't mean the money will be spent right away or sometimes not at all, if the governor has real serious differences with what comes out of the legislature. Okay. But this gives you a sense of the timing. We're right in the thick of this right now. The House is considering it. The Senate will consider it in the next month. And all of it will be decided by May.
James,
Yes?
does the governor have to sign it?
The governor does not have to sign it. Like any bill, he can veto it. But the consequences of vetoing, I'm actually not familiar with the process if the governor does veto the budget. But the consequences, I think, of vetoing the budget would be similar to what happens at the federal level when the president and Congress can't agree on the budget, which is we're stuck. We're in impasse. The monies are not released, and we're in serious trouble in terms of funding operations. Okay, So I think I'm about 3 or 4 minutes over my 15-minute allocation, but here's the 10 things I wanted to communicate recapped, and this is the only slide with a bunch of words on it. But first, most of our money comes from the general excise tax. Okay, that's a tax on every transaction, every good or service, and it is regressive because it impacts people who spend more of their money on necessities. It impacts them more because they end up spending a greater portion of their money paying for those taxes than people with higher incomes. Number 2, in most areas we're spending about the same or less than other states. Those major categories we talked about, what we think about in terms of the budget: education, transportation. The one exception that might be human services, where we rank relatively high. We spend comparatively small parts of the budget on things we might consider important, okay, like the environment, for example, or kids under the age of 5. I encourage you to actually think of something that you think is really important and go back to that interactive map and see where it fits on that. I was shocked, for example, that the amount that we spend on the environment is so small when we talk about the environment as such an important asset in Hawaii. And it's something important to Kanu, so I took a special look at that. We have a huge future challenge coming up in our debt and unfunded promises for pension and health benefits for retired public workers. And the work to solve that begins now. We're actually shouldering a bigger problem in that area than most other states, in part because our life expectancy in Hawaii is longer, and in part because, for good reason, we've made generous commitments to public workers in terms of pension and health benefits when those contracts were negotiated. Those increases in those commitments for retirees, plus increasing costs of medical care, will drive up spending such that the anticipated shortfall every year, starting next year, is going to be more than $300 million, okay, out into the foreseeable future. Where we're at in the process is the governor's proposed this budget. The legislature is going to consider it now, first the House, then the Senate. And each of us can make an impact by contacting especially the chairs of the House Finance Committee, that's Sylvia Luke, and the Senate Ways and Means Committee, that's David Ige, and sharing our views on where we wish we would save more and spend more. We don't have to be budget experts to do this. You can look at that map and say to yourself, you know what, this commitment looks relatively small to what I think is important. I wish we were spending more on this, and here's where I think it might come from. Here's where I wish it would come from. But communicating our ideas in that kind of way, that simple way of saying, here's where I wish we would spend more, here's where I think we can save, I think is an effective way of communicating with the people with a lot of decision-making power over what the budget will look like. If you live in the community, in the district of the chairs, or even members of the Finance Committee and Ways and Means Committee, but the chairs in particular, for David Ige, his district spans Pearl City and Aiea. For Sylvia Luke, her district is Paoa, Papakolea, Paoa, and Pacific Heights. If you live in those areas, you have special influence over something that affects everybody in the state, and therefore you have a special responsibility to understand the budget and to make your opinion known. That's your representative representing your district and your interests, and that's what's going to be factored in when they're making decisions about the budget. Of course, their job is to consider the state as a whole, but the point is that you, among all the citizens of the state, have disproportionate power as a citizen, as a constituent of these people who are making decisions over the budget. And so if you live in those areas, make your voice heard. That's part of our commitment as Kanu, and part of the reason why we're doing these capital workshops. And a step beyond the capital workshops is we're going out into these communities, and we're starting this weekend actually, canvassing in the districts of these representatives, the chairs of the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee, not to push an agenda, but to ask people what's important to you. Did you know that your representative is a key decision maker on the budget? And given that, is there something that's important to you? Is there something you wish was in the budget, or something you wish would change about how we spend our resources or raise the resources for the state? So our job is to make the information simple, accessible, and then to listen. And that's what this process, including this workshop, is all about.